He's a senior editor of a New American magazine. He travels the world reporting on the United Nations. He's one of the foremost experts in the world on United Nations, specifically UNESCO, which has something to do with what we're dealing with in South Georgia. He has a really good resume. I didn't even think to bring it, but he spoke. We had him in Waycross to speak on some issues back last August, and he knows a lot about the United Nations. So.
All right. So we're glad to have you by Zoom, and go right ahead and make a few comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. As Brooks mentioned, I'm a journalist. I've been following the United Nations around the world for the last 15 years. I've been all around the world my entire life, grew up in 8 countries on 4 continents, so very familiar with the UN. I've been close to it all my life. And I want to speak out in support of this bill for a number of reasons. I want to start by saying that this bill really is needed. I know there are comments, and we already heard some, that it's kind of superfluous. You know, why do we need this? It is absolutely essential that states get to work, I believe right now, protecting the sovereignty of their states and of their people, and of course protecting the liberties of their people. As the sponsor mentioned, other states are taking action. I'll give you a little bit of detail on that as we move forward, and I believe Georgia must do so as well. Now, to start off with, the American people gave a massive mandate victory to Donald Trump, and he ran on a very unapologetic platform of stopping globalism and protecting the sovereignty of the United States. I believe all of the American people would support this if they knew it, and a vast majority of Americans, and especially the vast majority of the folks in Georgia, your constituents, would agree that we should not have an outside organization like the United Nations, that's frequently referred to as a dictator's club for obvious reasons, dictating policy in the United States or in the state of Georgia. Already, UN policies are affecting every area of life around the world. And the UN's very proud of this, despite having no legitimacy to do this, and they brag about this. As I said, I've been going to their meetings for 15 years all over the world. And I want to give you a few examples so that we can see concretely how this impacts the lives of everyday folks in Georgia. Back in 2015, the UN approved, through the General Assembly, the Sustainable Development Goals. They called this the 2030 Agenda. And the president of the UN General Assembly, which is their kind of wannabe parliament, wannabe legislature, referred to this document as the Master Plan for Humanity. Now, it was never ratified by the U.S. Senate, although the Obama administration treated it as an executive agreement and began implementing it right away. And this seeks to influence policy around the world in everything from agriculture and education to healthcare and abortion. An even broader plan, this was the UN's plan for the 21st century, it's called Agenda 21, contains hundreds of pages of policy prescriptions that are fundamentally incompatible with our federal constitution and with the state constitution of Georgia and our other states, and of course fundamentally incompatible with the principles that underpin these governing documents that are supposed to make up the foundation of the rule of law in our country and in our states. More recently, I was at the UN headquarters for the Summit of the Future. This was in September of last year. Under the leadership of Joe Biden and the United Nations and the Communist Chinese dictatorship, they adopted an international agreement they referred to as the Pact for the Future. This document was adopted by consensus, which means every government, at the very least, consented to its approval. And it very clearly, again, I encourage you to read it, very clearly seeks to influence policy around the world in education, agriculture, military, culture, internet, speech, business, and much more. And again, this was never ratified by the U.S. Senate as required for any international agreement to be binding. And yet again, we're seeing this being implemented as we speak all across the world. Now, they've made their agenda very clear. If you go back to the Habitat 1 summit in the early 1970s in Vancouver, the UN produced the Vancouver Declaration, where they made crystal clear that sustainable development ultimately means undermining and eliminating private land ownership and private control of land. They see this as an obstacle to be overcome. And again, I encourage each of you to go consult this international document for yourselves. The UN's own leaders have been very, very open about this agenda. In fact, the current Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, literally comes out of the Socialist Party. He was the leader of the Socialist Internationale, it's the world's largest organization of socialist and communist political parties. And he is on record supporting his socialism, expressing his hostility to the principles upon which our nation was founded. Here's a few concrete examples of how these things affect your constituents. In the recently adopted Pact for the Future, which I mentioned, the UN and its member states promised to join forces in silencing what they refer to as misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. Well, this is very simply a call for censorship. We have a First Amendment in the United States that's supposed to protect our right to free speech. Most of our state constitutions protect our right to free speech. So it is unconscionable for an international organization to be calling on governments to silence us. This term hate speech was actually introduced into the UN lexicon by the Soviet Union back in the 1970s to silence speech that it hated. And so Georgia should have absolutely nothing to do with these kinds of agreements and policies. Now, the UN, through various agencies such as the World Health Organization and its education agency, UNESCO, is working with education officials around the world to sexualize children, to promote the LGBT agenda, to normalize transgenderism, and even to normalize the idea that children have a right to engage in sexual activities. Georgians, your constituents, would be absolutely appalled if they knew the things that UNESCO is right this moment encouraging in classrooms all around the world. Anybody who doesn't understand that UNESCO is already involved in our public school system hasn't been paying attention. The Obama administration bragged about it. The Biden administration bragged about it. Local school board members continue to brag about it to this day. UN Sustainable Development Initiatives threaten our private property rights in many of our key industries like agriculture. If you don't believe me, go ask the Dutch, go ask the Sri Lankans, whose governments implemented policies that had the effect of destroying their agricultural sectors. And in both of those cases and many others, they specifically cited the UN's policies on sustainable development, the 2030 Agenda, and Agenda 21 as the rationale for implementing these agreements and these policies in their countries. Now, with help from swamp creatures in Washington, D.C., the UN is trying to weasel its way into Georgia through the Okefenokee Swamp. I just listened to your hearing on this. They want to declare it a UNESCO World Heritage Site. As I explained to the good folks of South Georgia when I was up there a few months ago, this has already resulted in sensitive areas across the United States coming under UN pressure to restrict private property rights, to restrict activities. And if the state of Georgia thinks some activities need to be restricted, that should be a decision for the state of Georgia, not for the United Nations. There's a UN agreement on what they call indigenous peoples that purports to require the return of all lands that may have ever been used by indigenous peoples prior to colonialists arriving. Now, if you listen to the UN's own experts on this, they have boldly and publicly declared that this means virtually the entire landmass of the United States, including Mount Rushmore, needs to be returned to native tribes and things like this. So these are real policies that can have real effects. And I want to end with a little segment on what other states are doing, because this is not a problem that's unique to Georgia, of course. A lot of states are taking bold action to protect their citizens and their sovereignty from the UN and its un-American agenda. Louisiana just offered us a very good example. 2 years ago, they passed a very powerful law banning any UN or World Health Organization involvement in their policies. Interestingly, this was supported by Democrats and Republicans, in addition to citizens from all across the political spectrum. Last year, the state of Tennessee strengthened an existing law that bans any state or local involvement in UN schemes like Agenda 21 or the 2030 Agenda, while calling on Congress to withdraw from the United Nations. Not sure if you guys saw Elon Musk tweeted out yesterday that'd be a good idea for us to withdraw from the UN. There are bills in both houses of Congress to get that done, and Donald Trump is at this very moment withdrawing us from a whole range of UN agencies. I think the people of the state of Georgia would like to see those things at the state level as well. Now, after the disastrous policies that they pushed on the world from Geneva, half of the nation's governors, I believe your governor was one of those who signed an open letter to Joe Biden, letting him know that they would not be allowing the World Health Organization to influence policy in their states when it comes to health care. It's great that the governors are speaking out. It's great that they're telling the Biden administration that they would not comply, but it would be much stronger if it was codified into state law. And this is not a new phenomenon. In 2012, Alabama lawmakers voted unanimously to ban Agenda 21, a UN program in their state. Every Democrat in the House and the Senate voted for this legislation. This was not seen as controversial. They were concerned about the UN's hostility to private property rights and self-government, and we all should be as well. If I had one recommendation for this legislation, it would be to make it stronger. It would be to include enforcement mechanisms, making sure that local bureaucrats, state bureaucrats do not defy the will of the people of Georgia expressed through their elected representatives in the legislature. We must take action to protect our state and our country from the UN and the agenda it represents. And I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
All righty. Thank you very, very much. Anybody on the committee have a question or comment? Okay, number 8.
Thank you, Chair. You talk about the United Nations providing influence, but under their charter, it states that the United Nations has no authority to intervene in matters which are within the domestic jurisdiction of any state, while this principle shall not prejudice the application of enforcement measures under Chapter 7 of the charter. Their own charter dictates that they cannot intervene in matters within our country. And you talk about how they've had influence within other nations, but you don't show evidence of that, of how they have it. You do talk about the Senate, and our U.S. Senate has never ratified anything for them to have influence within our country. And you try to gloss over that by talking about other nations in which they themselves have the choice to ratify those policies. So, how would this bill override our Senate? And I don't believe our Senate ever would ratify any kind of policy that would provide influence over Georgia. How would this bill override the Senate's ratification of a policy?
There's several questions there. I want to address one by one. First of all, I'll start with your last question. How would this bill be able to override what the U.S. Senate were to ratify? If there's no concern with the UN getting involved in the domestic affairs of a nation, why would the Senate ratify any treaty? Second of all, as Thomas Jefferson explained very clearly when our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence were being written, just because something is ratified by the Senate does not grant new powers to the federal government. The Supreme Court actually upheld this principle in 1957 in the case Reed versus Covert, when international agreements were being cited to demand policy changes in the United States. And it was very clearly articulated by the Supreme Court that international agreements do not supersede our Constitution. As Article 6 of the Constitution makes clear, federal statutes and international treaties are the supreme law of the land, along with the Constitution, if they are made in pursuance thereof. In other words, if they're not made in pursuance thereof, they are not the supreme law of the land. And in fact, as many of our founding fathers, including James Madison, the primary author of our Constitution, and Thomas Jefferson, the primary author of our Declaration of Independence, explained, it is not just the right of states to resist such usurpations, it is their duty. That is actually how they described it in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which were a response by those states to the Alien and Sedition Acts early on in our history after the ratification of the Constitution. As for UN policies affecting the United States, I actually gave several examples in my testimony. I'm not sure if you didn't hear those, but I could give many, many more examples. As I mentioned, this is something I've been following for a very long time. And I think you made another error. There are dozens and dozens of international conventions, agreements, treaties, and pacts that have been negotiated under the UN Charter that do, in fact, have the effect of interfering in the sovereign jurisdiction of nation states. And it's interesting that we're discussing it now because, as I mentioned, I was at UN headquarters for the Summit of the Future in September of last year. And several governments, a collection of 7 governments, actually raised to put out an amendment into the Pact for the Future that reminded everyone that this is what the UN Charter says and that the UN must not interfere in the domestic affairs of nations. And very interestingly, this amendment was rejected. It was voted down. So frankly, I think the people of Georgia do not want foreign dictators making policy or even influencing policy in their state. And so any more questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Representative.